want to say thank you to our presenting sponsors. Without you, we could not have this conversation. I'm Julia Patrick, CEO of the American Nonprofit Academy. Jarrett Ransom is emceeing an awards show this morning for Ide Bailey. It is the National Resourcefulness Award. So when we have her back on tomorrow, we'll find out who the big winners were. But this is the big deal. We have the Gran Queso, Jennifer Alleva from Your Part-Time Controller. I have to tell you, Jennifer, I was kind of groggily waking up the other morning and my alarm goes off to NPR and your ad came up.
You heard it.
I was like, so
wonderful.
Yeah,
That's
I was like, oh my God, holy moly.
Yep. So we're serving nonprofits nationwide and we are on NPR nationwide right now. So it's exciting. We love to hear people that hear it across the country.
It was really cool because at first I thought, oh, I'm dreaming about Your Part-Time Controller. And then I was like, oh no, wait, this is legit. This is real.
We're actually here. Yes.
Yeah. So that was really, really cool. So here's Jennifer's information. YPTC, very interesting company because they just work with nonprofits. And one of the magical things about this is that, for any of you that are watching the show today, there are differences in the way we express things and we track things in the nonprofit sector. And so when you find partners that can actually work with you and are educated and can be value add, it's a magical, magical thing. So we can't say enough about our friends at Your Part-Time Controller. Okay, now, today, Jennifer, we want to talk about keeping your nonprofit safe. And as we were saying before we got on this call, I think a lot of people are under the impression that fraud does not happen to nonprofits.
It happens, sadly, too much because we serve over 700 nonprofit organizations and we start when organizations, they call us because they're a mess sometimes. Yeah. And we have to get in and dig in and uncover what's going on. And often, several times a year, we'll uncover a fraud at a new client that went unnoticed because the management wasn't paying attention or keeping their eye off the ball as it related to their financial management. And that's unfortunate. It really, really is. When I taught at the University of Pennsylvania, I taught a class on nonprofit financial management for non-financial managers. These were graduate students. And I would say, my goal of this class is that you guys don't become that guy or that gal that is in a nonprofit that ends up on the front page of the newspaper, or I guess these days in social media, that is subject to a fraud. And because that's really not where a nonprofit wants to be. It's so hurtful to the donors and to the constituents that a nonprofit serves. So yeah, it does happen. I have a stat here about how much a nonprofit might lose. According to the 2020 Global Fraud Study of the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, a typical organization loses an estimated 5% of its annual revenue to fraud. For a nonprofit organization, the median loss is about $75,000 with an average loss of $639,000 on a particular incident. And, for $75,000 loss, that might not be huge to some organizations. Well, I will tell you that it's huge to the vast majority of the clients that we serve. So don't want to have that happen.
So when I hear that type of stat juxtaposed between the for-profit sector, it almost makes it sound like the fraud is going on longer and it's not being caught as quickly. That's just a supposition.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It goes, I have some examples I'm going to talk about that it's gone on for years. So, when I talk about fraud too, I talk about the inside job and then the external risks of fraud that an organization might have, because there's a lot of that too. So it's not just inside fraud that an organization has to worry about. It's also those external risks. I definitely have things to say about those as well today.
So let's start off with, like, who would steal from a nonprofit? I mean, that to me is just like, what?
You think like, how does that happen? Well,
Yeah.
people steal because they have a financial crisis or they're in a bad way and they have the opportunity. So that opportunity is the key thing here to prevent for your organization. So you can't really prevent people's crises from happening,
Right.
but that opportunity, and then the person will rationalize the situation because, like, let's say I need the money, or the organization has enough to handle their programs. Well, in audit terms, that's called the fraud triangle. The opportunity, the rationalization, and the pressure the person's under. So it's
Interesting.
something to think about, and you want to prevent.
So does it seem like, and this might be a complete bias, but that you would kind of monitor the health of your employees, especially in your accounting department? I mean, it seems to me like,
I mean, I think
if you had gambling, if you had substance abuse in your family or yourself, and things like that would be pressures.
Yeah. So if you had, a lot of the red flags are, a person that does have a lot of outward financial issues or pressures you got to be careful of. And then for sure, when you hire someone in your accounting or anybody that handles any of the finances in any part of your organization, you want to do a full, complete criminal background check on them, because that is one of the preventative measures from the beginning, because there are people that have criminal records that apply for jobs for nonprofits, and that's one way you can at least snuff that out. So you want to be really careful on the people that you hire. But I have an example of one of our largest frauds. There was a controller that had complete control over the checkbook of the organization, including having a signature stamp of the executive director, and would be able to sign checks on his own. The executive director was like, oh, okay, yeah, you can just use my stamp and sign the check. So obviously that was a falling of the executive director of not, having any control over the situation. But when we started to look, the person was writing checks to themselves or to himself, and then covering it up in the general ledger, and then also doctoring the bank statements to make it look like the checks were written to a vendor. So that went on for years. And the problem there were many. The person had full control. And there was no checks and balances over, what that person was doing or, review. And then the auditors got, I guess, duped as well. So that is something that could, definitely have been prevented.
You'd call that like an internal control then.
Yes.
It sounds like you have to back up and say whether you are suspectful of somebody or not is not the issue.
Yeah. In this case, right. So I was getting to the fact that the guy was driving a Rolls Royce around.
Oh my God, Jennifer.
He never
Jennifer.
No, it's a true story. And he never took vacation, and it was kind of clear because he never wanted anybody to look at the books, because except for the auditors who he duped, but he was fearful of people looking into what he was doing. And it was clear he had been married multiple times, and it was clear that he was having financial issues, even though he was driving around the Rolls Royce. So there was a lot of red flags around that before we came in and uncovered the fraud. So a couple other ways that fraud can happen is through credit card abuse. That's a biggie. And also payroll schemes. That's something that executive directors should look out for, and board members all the time, like fictitious employees showing up and additional pay being added to somebody's pay. We had a situation once where the executive director of one of our clients just increased their pay on the payroll, in the payroll, and wasn't caught until one of our staff looked at it and said, was this approved by the board? called the board chair, and the board chair's like, no, we did not approve that. And then it started unraveling some of the other issues that were happening with that individual and what they were doing. So
Let me ask you a question, and this just like kind of popped into my head, but would you say that, like, if you're an organization of under a certain budget or certain number of staff versus an organization of a larger budget and larger staff, that there's a propensity to have more risk? Like, so, a larger organization has more opportunity, or is it the smaller? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think, smaller organizations have a tougher time having segregation of duties, and that's an internal control, a very key internal control organizations should have, that,
Okay.
you separate your approval process from the check signing process, and now it's the electronic payment process, from the reconciliation process. So super important for that. And it's harder to do that in smaller organizations, yet not impossible. And quite frankly, I mean, not to, plug us, but any outsourced accounting firm, an outside person coming in and doing that reconciliation can help in that process and be, part of the internal control process, if you will. So
yeah. That makes sense. That makes sense. So let's talk about oversight. I mean,
yes.
Obviously with an organization like yours, you're doing oversight, but in the real world of day to day, there's got to be some sort of issue for oversight. And I'm wondering if you can even just explain that, what we should be looking for.
So going back to the definition of internal controls, it's what organizations have in place, the policies and procedures that you want to have, and the oversight. Oversight is part of that whole internal control process.
Okay.
And oversight starts with the board and management. And that's what we call the tone at the top, making sure that they are walking the walk. They're exemplifying excellent behavior in financial management so that other people know that we're getting, people are looking and they
People
care.
are watching.
They really care. Yeah, they care about internal controls and what's going on. The other thing I think about oversight and the tone at the top is this intentionality of being, thinking that fraud might happen to you. That it's not something we don't think about. It's something that's in front of us all of the time. And we like to call that healthy skepticism. That attitude, the attitude that people have that is like, okay, we're going to be on the lookout for fraud at all turns. We can't let our guard down. And so healthy skepticism is like an audit term, but we use it in just general, help of boards and management thinking, think to have that curiosity when something's going wrong, use common sense and just follow your instincts. If you think something's wrong, it probably is. When I taught my class, I would always tell them, don't be afraid to ask questions. Non-financial managers are often like intimidated by the accountants or the financial managers because they're like, they're using all of these words like balance sheet. I don't feel comfortable asking questions, but more often than not, even, non-financial managers are, working for nonprofits are smart and they have good instincts. So trust yourselves. That's the thing I can emphasize. I hope to emphasize the most when I talk about this topic. Don't be duped and don't be afraid to ask questions. So.
What you just said, it's kind of, for me, it's a light bulb. And that is, this is what I heard you say.
Yeah.
Don't wait for it to happen and then be responsive. Be thinking this could come down the road. It's a reality. We're not so pure that it's not going to happen to us, that it does happen. So part of that, I'd love to get your feedback on the nonprofit versus for-profit response to fraud.
Yeah, so it's sad, when a fraud happens to an organization, it's an embarrassing thing.
Yeah.
And we are worried about our donors and constituents, what they're going to think, and if they're going to now perhaps withhold contributions, or maybe we won't be able to fulfill our programs as much. And so sometimes it is swept under the rug. And we've seen that happen. And that's unfortunate. Of course, we always recommend our clients, if that happens to them, to be very forthright in coming out to the public as far as making sure that, it's a part, it's integrity. It shows the integrity of the organization if they are being honest about what's going on. And then, quite frankly, there is a question in the 990 that is required to be answered if you have a material diversion of assets. And
that means fraud?
That means fraud.
Oh my God, I never knew that that's what it meant.
Absolutely. It's in part 6, section A, and these are questions talking about, the internal controls or what is happening, the policies of the organization. And the question is, did the organization become aware during the year of a significant diversion of the organization's assets? And they have to answer yes to that. If it was the fraud was the lesser of 5% of gross receipts or gross revenue, 5% of total assets, or $250,000. So any organization that had a diversion of assets, a fraud of greater than $250,000 has to report that. Smaller organizations might have a much smaller threshold based on what their gross receipts are or assets are. And that becomes a really tough question to answer. And the question is, if we have to answer that, yes, then we ought to get in front of that with the public. Because often there's a delay in when the 990 is issued and it gets out to the public, and when that diversion of assets has happened. So it's probably better to be a little bit more honest and upfront about that. And we always recommend to our clients, if they do have a fraud, immediately talk to an attorney, immediately, to get their advice. And then if they are going to come out, figure out what your communication strategy is going to be, talk to a PR firm, and make sure that you've addressed the problem and you're talking to the public and your constituents about what you changed to make sure that it doesn't happen again.
Right. What you learned,
yes,
and how you're going to navigate this. Now, let me ask you, with your vast experience in this world of working and serving nonprofits, I've always heard that nonprofits, by the nature of what they do and their ethos, don't prosecute and don't really go after these people. That if you owned a business, you'd be like, calling the police, I'm getting their ass in jail. And, you're really aggressive. But that if you're a nonprofit, you're like, well, they had problems, let's get them counseling. And so that the perpetrators can go from nonprofit to nonprofit.
We actually had that happen at one of our clients, where the bookkeeper that was in place prior to us taking over had worked in multiple organizations throughout the country, and we come to find out committed fraud in those organizations, was never prosecuted. It wasn't in the criminal background. I'm not sure if the client never did the criminal background check. I can't remember, but there was a history there. And that's the importance of having the criminal background checks, and also the risk that an organization does for the nonprofit world in general if they don't prosecute and don't make it public that the organization had a problem, because that can be perpetrated in another organization. And, it becomes a trend with a person. Once they do it at one organization, they can get away with it at another. And that's really, really unfortunate. So we always recommend, talk to an attorney, but try to be as, you really prosecute. I mean, that's our recommendation in the vast majority of cases.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's such an interesting thing, because the fear associated with how your community is going to look at you, your donors, your funders, I can see this reticence of saying, we've failed you, our investor.
Oh, absolutely.
You know, if you
Absolutely.
will.
It does not bode well for that organization for the future, especially if they're not upfront about it and it comes out in another way. And that's, I think that, they say honesty is the best policy. So,
Exactly.
yeah, yeah.
Now, talk to me about this, drill down a little bit more to disclosing the fraud to the public and the stakeholders. Are you saying that, you should be real specific about the money and the process and all this? Or are you saying that, it's more, this happened and these are the corrective measures? Like, where do you find that balance?
I think that's the best way to go. Of course, you're required based on what I said before in your 990, if you reach those particular thresholds, to put that information in, and in Schedule O in the 990, it absolutely asks you for more details. Now, you don't want to name names per se, but you do want to, I think there's more information that the public would want to know. But again, getting in front of that. And, it goes back to, making sure that it doesn't happen in the first place, I think. And, and I always call you have to acknowledge the fraud facts of life. The fraud facts of life. We were talking a little bit before about, it's not going to happen in this nonprofit. All of our people are so good, and we trust them implicitly. And but it does happen, and you can't really get lulled into that sense of comfort in a nonprofit. And I've had many of staff saying, "I can't believe this happened," and it, or a client say, "I can't believe this happened," and that's having that healthy skepticism and having that intentionality that it could happen. Absolutely. And you have to remember that sometimes people are crappy, people, even in a nonprofit. Yeah. And that's sad, but it's a fact of life. And especially if a person gets under pressure, say they have, huge medical expenses or a problem with that, and then they see the opportunity and they take it and they run with it. And then the other fact of life is when there's smoke, there's fire. If there's one thing going on, it's probably multiple things going on. I mentioned in that story about our the executive director that upped his pay, who's also had a lot of inappropriate credit card purchases as well. So it's in multiple areas typically when there is fraud. So.
Let me ask you this question. How many of your clients, and again, I know with over 700 clients, you have such a fascinating lens.
Yeah.
How many of your clients are coming to you and they have found this versus you have found this? Is there?
I would say, so with all the clients that we add in a year, we probably uncover or are part of less than a half a dozen frauds, I would say. So it's not like prevalent throughout, and certainly we would hate to have anything ever happen when we're our watches, but it could happen without us knowing it for sure as well. But it often is uncovered when we first come in. And sometimes, yes, there is a situation where an organization has already uncovered it and says, we need to
unravel,
go in a different direction of our accounting department, bring us in, unravel it, see, how much damage was done, look in different areas, not just the area, because when there's smoke, there's fire, look in different areas that might have caused the problem. So, credit cards, bill pay, payroll, these are all places where you could have problems. I talked a little bit about the external things too, that you really have to be on the lookout for. And that is these phishing schemes. You're getting those emails from supposedly the executive director saying, send me money or send me gift cards. Or, even more risky, data breach that your information or your donor's information is at risk. So I just had a couple of tips, and I know we only have a few minutes, but I thought it was really helpful to your audience, for a couple of tips to or takeaways to do. And one of the things is we talked about hiring the right people for sure, making sure that your board is composed of some financial management people, have a, somebody with experience that can be thinking about these controls and what should be in place. Make sure you have a finance committee and potentially a separate audit committee. They could be one and the same, but certainly, have the right board structure.
Okay.
Ask questions, demand accountability. Don't get duped, and don't be afraid to ask the questions that you should. Segregate duties. We talked about that. Avoid organization credit cards. Try to have your staff use their own credit cards and apply for reimbursement. It solves a ton of problems.
Okay.
Have the treasurer or approve the executive director's expense report. That's
Okay, wait, say that again. Have the
treasurer of the board approve the executive director's expense report.
Okay.
Because if you have internal staff approving, they could be intimidated and not ask the right questions to the executive director, questioning what they're spending money on.
I've never heard that, but it's brilliant.
So, yes, monthly bank reconciliations done separately from anybody else involved in the payment process, if possible. The other big recommendation that I make and we make to uncover bank schemes or losses right away in your bank account is have the executive director on a daily basis just open up their bank online banking system and check out the transactions for that day. Do the same thing. If they do have internal credit cards, do that. You can do it
On your phone.
And if it's too much for the executive director, a board member that's involved or somebody that you can really trust to look at that's separate from the accounting area. Because immediately you might be able to pick something up on looking at that.
Yeah. Love that.
Yes.
Love that.
And that's going to solve a lot of problems.
Mm-hmm.
Monthly financial reports, looking at variance analysis to budget our expenses. Is something inflated that we had no idea why it was? So that asking those questions. Have the executive director look at payroll reports. Mm-hmm. Because if you have a fictitious employee there, they'll be able to catch it. Annual audit. Have the board review the 990. Make sure you're training your staff on cyber risk and cyber bullies, and all of that might be problematic, and certainly the phishing schemes, because you can't talk enough, in my opinion, on any organization about phishing schemes and that might happen. We've seen it. We've seen, sadly, staff at our clients fall for it, and it's hard to get the money back. And then finally, just insurance, making sure that you have the right insurance for employee theft and for cyber coverage. So
I hate to put you on the spot, but I could tell you were kind of reviewing. You had some notes.
Yeah.
You would get that to me. I will put that together on a one sheet.
Yeah.
And anybody who has been watching this could email us at the Nonprofit Show, and then we'll send a PDF over. If Great. You're okay with that.
Oh, I'm totally fine with that. We have our top 10. That was actually 13 that I put together. So it's our top 13, lucky 13. And we'll absolutely put it together in a nice PDF, and you can put it on your website for anyone that wants it. And email.
Let's do that, because you said some things that I hadn't heard before. I think that the big takeaway for me today, Jennifer, is that it's not if, but it's when. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't really reflect upon the goodness or the value or the charitable spirit and nature and mission, vision, and values of your organization. It's the human factor.
Absolutely.
And so we need to kind of be aware of that and protect ourselves. It was magical to have you talk about this.
You listened well.
Well, it's super crazy. I mean, I've had people, I remember a couple of years ago, I had an executive director that called and said, hey, I've got this horrible problem. I've just found out that we've had a major fraud. I don't know what to do. I'm terrified of going public because I'm afraid it will just slash a bunch of funding. Yeah. And so I strategized with her and got her with some CPAs that could give her some advice, but it was tragic.
Yeah,
because
it's
you
rough.
really had an organization that did the work of the angels. And so I understand this thing. Hey, your part-time controller, Jennifer, managing partner, super interesting business because they work in our sector. They work in our sector. And so super cool business. I love their team.
Focus.
Yeah, it's really great. And I learn from them all the time. I love all the different folks that I've had the privilege of working with. So check out YPTC. Again, I'm Julia Patrick, CEO of the American Nonprofit Academy. Jarrett Ransom will be back tomorrow. She's been hosting an award show for the nonprofit sector. This, I want to make sure that you're part of. Every Friday, my favorite day, we do our Ask and Answer show, and it is sponsored by your part-time controller. Folks from all over the place send us questions, and then we answer it. We open up the chat room for our viewers to weigh in, answer questions, agree with us, disagree. It's crazy fun. You cannot believe the questions that people ask. It's extremely varied. And so check it out. It's a lot of fun.
I'd be happy to come on one Friday and answer a bunch of financial questions if
we should do that. We should, because we get, I will go to your team when I get accounting questions, and then I actually work with Erica Blair, and I'll say, what do you think? And then bless her heart, she has to go out to the different experts within your organization. And then
Erica is our marketing guru. So yes, so accounting's not her top thing. But speaking of, I did want to let your audience know that we are doing a series of national webinars, and our first one is coming up on October 30th, and we're going to be talking about dashboards, and we are calling it Dashboard Nirvana: from data chaos to data-driven decisions. So
love it. Well done. Because that, man, if we wave that flag all the time, you've got to use dashboards. Your C-suite, your boards, everybody needs to understand this tool. It makes things a lot easier.
So you can sign up at yptc.com, and then also sign up for our alerts, because we've been sending those out too as we get more and more information on PPP and other things that are coming out.
I was just going to say, with things changing in Congress, you do alert everybody. So it's a great tool. Well, Jennifer, thank you so much for being a part of the Nonprofit Show today. I learned a lot, as always, from you. I always feel like I pepper you with all these weird questions, but you get my brain going here, sister.
Well, thanks for having me, Julie. It's a pleasure.
Oh my gosh, it's been wonderful. As we end every day, we always say, stay well so you can do well. Thanks, everybody, and we'll see you tomorrow for Ask and Answer. It's sponsored by your part-time controller.